So I wanted to get on a cybersecurity expert. There's so much going on in this space at the moment across all areas, especially cybercrime. Jake Bernardez is a brilliant speaker with a very diverse background that includes missionary work, working for some of the top, largest tech companies in the world, right through to working for cybersecurity expert consultancy firm Whistic. We talk about everything from the vulnerability of the public sector in the UK in terms of cyber attacks. We talk about the rise of Chat GPT and how potentially Chat GPT could be the verb that replaces how we search the internet, which is a big claim that Jake brought up. We talk about the rise of AI generally. We talk about IoT, privacy, API security, which is a new one for me. We also talk about the destruction of jobs and the disruption of the labour market brought on by innovation around things like AI. Jake is a great guy, really interesting, brilliant speaker. We cover so many fascinating topics. We effortlessly swing from one topic to the other. It really was a very full-on conversation. I was actually exhausted by the end of it. It is Jake Bernardez. Jake, thank you so much for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast, and thank you for the T-shirt that you sent me, which I love, and I'm wearing around the office all the time. So my colleagues are like, where the hell did you get that from? But yeah, no, I really appreciate the T-shirt. Some great branding with your organization. Let's start with this one. I always ask this question to kick off. What does good leadership mean to you, Jake?
I think good leadership means being in the middle of your group, your army, your team. It means when you succeed, it was someone else's excellence and not yours. And when you fail, it was your mistake and not somebody else's. For me, true leaders put their necks above the pulpit, but are also willing to share, if not to give, every success they have to somebody else in their team.
I love that. That's a brilliant description of leadership. I think someone who's just willing to take the blame for when things go wrong, but not take the credit for when things go right. Pass the credit on to the people around them. I think that's brilliant, Jake. Let's dip into your background then. Can you give us an overview of your sort of background and your current role?
Yeah, so I've done pretty much almost every role I think that exists in cyber, although that's changing and evolving so much that might have changed by next week. But I worked at IBM, PwC, KPMG, consulting type roles, both as the technical pen tester, as a GRC consultant, which is kind of general or generic risk, looking at kind of strategy or maturity postures or assessments or certifications, stuff like SOC 2, ISO 27001, that kind of thing. From that, I suppose my career really changed. I moved from KPMG to NCC Group, who are a specialist cyber security consulting firm. Spent a bit of time across UK and Europe building up a profile and reputation for delivering large-scale engagements and transformation projects. And then one day got a phone call from my then boss, Ben Jepson, who said, can I go to a man? I'll be honest, I never Googled where a man was. Do you know where a man is?
No,
I didn't know either. So I just said, yeah, fine. My traditional approach to consulting was, yeah, sure, I can. I got off the phone and Googled it. Amman is actually the capital city of Jordan, as in Jordan in the Middle East. And it borders, obviously, Israel on one side, then Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Iran, all the places you probably don't want to be bordering. At the time, I had a daughter who was 3 months old, and I went out there to do a large piece of work for an airline and went out with my family in the end. We spent the best part of 6 months living and working in the Middle East. I then got back and got a call from Ben again and said, how do you fancy doing the US? So we then moved and spent just over a year and a half nearly, living and working out on the West Coast of the United States, where nice. I kind of built, I suppose, what I built as a personal brand, which is working with the startups in kind of CISO capabilities, helping them move from kind of, we have no security, we don't have a policy, but we want to go and sell to Goldman Sachs or Johnson & Johnson. And so we need to meet their requirements. So building all that up, did that at a whole host of companies until eventually one of those hired me, which was SingleStore, then called MemSQL, which is a database product, pretty disruptive in the database space, in fact. And I spent just about 3 years there helping build their cybersecurity function from scratch to various compliance certifications and to good enough to meet most of the Fortune 50's requirements from an audit perspective. And during that time, it carried on working with a number of other companies, one of which was Whistic, where I'd done some vCISO services. I'd always found the area fascinating. We might get into it more, but the vendor risk space has always been of one of real interest to me. And then moved over there last year as the VP of security, and now also run IT as well. My role there is much more diverse. I've kind of taken on, I suppose, a kind of wider spread, hands in all pies kind of executive role. So I do a lot with product, with engineering in terms of how we build and what we're building and why we're building it. One of the things I love most about leadership is you have that ability and that freedom to go and find problems and solve them. And that's kind of where I found one of the things I love about cyber and technology in general is that there's always a way to find a different problem, to search the solution and to work towards it. And that's what makes life interesting.
Absolutely. Do you mind if I ask you about your missionary work?
So I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as LDS. And a lot of young people in the church, men and women, when they're about 18, 19, go and give 2 years of volunteer work, completely self-funded. I was in Germany. We did a number of things, working with community groups, whether that was supporting with teaching English to people, talking about our beliefs and why they're important to us, working with soup kitchens or homeless kind of shelters, and whatever we could do to kind of reach out in the community.
Sure.
Fascinating thing to do. I would honestly say I learned a lot about who I am as a person, a lot about what it means to lead and what it means to be a good human being.
So did you do that straight after your education then?
Pretty much, yeah. I worked for a year to put some money away to do that, but pretty much, yeah.
Wow, fantastic. So when you look back at that period of your life now then, what do you think, what lessons did you learn and what sort of attributes did you gain from that experience which you've taken through your career?
I would say you learn humility.
Sure.
You learn that there are some things in life you can't change, and some people's situations and some people it's very hard to affect. We're taught right in our culture that if you have a will and you work hard, you can achieve anything. But there are lots of people for whom that's not true. And when you see that and you see people who struggle and you want to help and support them, and you try the best you can, but it becomes cyclical or it just never goes anywhere.
Yeah.
It's deeply humbling to think, well, actually, how appreciative you are of what you have and the opportunities that you have. And also to therefore be thankful for them and to take the time and the resources you're blessed and lucky enough to have to help others around us. Like society becomes more meaningful.
Yeah,
I think that's number one. I think I learned a lot about what makes people tick, like how to interact with people, not necessarily how to read people, because that sounds a little bit manipulative, but how to like kind of see how can you get the best out of someone. I think that's a key skill as a leader is recognizing this person reacts this way to this and this way to that. So how can I help them achieve what their potential is? Because again, come back to leadership, but for me, that's it, right? The greatest compliment you can get is one of your team leaving for a more senior role than you can possibly offer them.
Yeah,
that means you did your job. So I think I learned that, and I think I learned the value of hard work.
You seem very driven, Jake. You've obviously progressed through your career. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of what makes you tick and what drives you on, what gets you out of bed in the morning. Do you know what I mean? Obviously, your career's taken this trajectory and you've gone into cybersecurity, but I suppose there's probably some solid foundations behind that which drive you on every day. Would that be fair to say?
Look, I'm currently watching Breakpoint on Netflix, right, about the tennis players. When you start to see these like top elite sports people and you start to understand kind of where or how they got to what they got to, you start to see there's a natural obsessiveness, a kind of focus and a drive that you can't teach, I don't think.
No,
I think people either want to keep pushing, keep progressing, keep learning, keep trying, keep doing something more, or they don't. And I think I probably fall into that former category, that inside of me, whenever I kind of achieved the last thing, it was always, what's the next thing? Where do I go next? What do I do next? What can I affect next?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So quite early on in your career, you worked for two of the biggest IT companies in the world, in KPMG and IBM. I know KPMG are more of more than just IT, but you see what I mean. They're big, massive corporate organizations. What did you take from that enterprise corporate world, which you have taken through into your startup scale-up world?
Yeah.
When you look back at that period of your life, do you look at that quite fondly and formative for you, or something else?
It's interesting. I've seen many different things. I think from both of them, I took people. I'm a big learner from the people that I work with or for. Yeah. And in both of them, I saw great leaders, people who had things that I recognized as great attributes and that I wanted to develop or build into my character. And some on the opposite, where I went, actually, that's not a great leader. That's not what I want to be in the future. So I think from people, you can always learn. And in companies of that type, the leadership is always usually of a very high and very experienced standard. Yeah. I think in IBM, you saw a love of technology. There's a culture there of people who love tech. They're interested, right? I think the company has become so big that it's now hard to be disruptive or innovative
Sure.
in certain ways. And I think I probably took that from it. I've worked in a lot of startups and scale-ups since then. And I think it's interesting to see how much easier it is when you're in a 100, 200 person company to just completely pivot and say, we're not solving the job that we came to solve, so let's just change the product entirely. I think you can't do that when you're IBM. You have to go and acquire someone else, basically. At KPMG, I saw the pros and cons of process. So obviously the big audit firms and the big consulting firms are massively process driven. There is defined, this is how you do things, both in your career progression and in kind of how you deliver a report or an assessment from end to end.
Yeah.
So for me, part of that was, well, let's look at that and say there are core steps in everything which fundamentally have to exist. And if you just go running around crazily, you'll never achieve anything. But at the same time, as I've grown in my career, I've looked back and gone, sometimes we have to just sit there and say, is the process necessary? Like, are there lots of things there which are actually hindering? And if you look now, I look at like, we've done some close work with KPMG. I've got good friends there. There's a lot of great things at KPMG too.
Yeah.
But at their own admission, there are also times where they will lose to small innovative startups because they can't compete on price because their processes are too complex and too lengthy. And so they're taking too many hours, which costs too much money. So I think I learned a lot from both of them in terms of people, the importance in good terms and bad terms of process.
Yeah.
Trying to maintain a mindset of innovation and of disruption. But also just, I think, within that environment, you get an exposure to so much. I now work in companies that are quite focused on one thing, delivering to maybe one market segment or especially just one product. Whereas back then, you'd go and see so many different companies in so many different industries with different types of work. And that kind of variety helps you build a foundational skill set, which is you can't find outside of consulting, and especially can't find outside the big consulting houses.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, there's so many of the sort of top CEOs and CTOs have worked for a big four consultancy early on in their career because it seems to be a great, it's a great grounding. So last question on your sort of background, if you like. I'm just keen to understand, we've talked about your missionary work and the stuff working for big corporates. What stand out for you, Jake, as the key milestones in your career which really set you on this path that you went on?
I think my don't say no attitude at NCC Group was a big one. That was a big move in itself, right? I moved from KPMG to a very short time at a small company called Baringa and then to NCC Group. And leaving the big four, there were a lot of questions asked whether that is the right thing to do, especially the level that I left at. But I felt that I had aspirations to achieve better things and that I couldn't move quickly enough in the organization. So I think that move being one. I think inside of NCC Group, never saying no. It's like nearly missed several or did miss several events in my children's life from flying all over Europe, then eventually transitioned the whole family to the Middle East, came back and within months transitioned the whole family to America and then back to the UK. I think that's a big one. I think then leaving consulting to go into a company that literally had nothing at the time and being told you need to build this quick because we want to sell to major banks. And then we were living in the UK and I was working in the US. So I work a time zone that starts maybe in the afternoon. And I was at least at Memphis and single store flying every month for a week. And I still fly fairly regularly to and from the US. But I think those decisions are what's helped me have an exposure and career trajectory that I wouldn't have had I taken a more traditional and standard approach.
Sure. No, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit more about Whistic then? You talk about the vendor risk space. What exactly is that, Jake? And what is the purpose of Whistic? What problem are you trying to solve?
Yeah, so let me go back. So I think it's an interesting space. So I spent a number of engagements as a consultant look at vendor risk management. And what that means is you have companies, maybe it's a major bank, HSBC, Barclays, Santander, whoever you want to choose, right? And they will have a vendor chain of maybe 500 vendors. And they will say, right, we need to assess the security posture of these vendors and they need to meet sufficient standards for us to demonstrate we've done sufficient due diligence to maintain various certifications and just to make sure that there aren't unknown unknowns that we can't protect against. So the way that they do that traditionally is they go and bring in one of the big four or other available consulting firms. And they will build out a questionnaire set, which is an Excel spreadsheet of anything between 100 and 500 questions. And it will be tiered between maybe gold, silver, bronze. They'll risk assess each of their vendors to say this is a high risk, medium or low risk vendor, and then issue them a questionnaire in accordance with that assessment. And they will respond with a whole host of answers. Questions like, do you have network security? Do you have a pen test? Do you have an ISO cert? How do you deal with authentication? How do you deal with authorization? And they'll respond with evidence. And there'll be this to and fro between them too. That generally happens in email. at a best case, it happens in kind of like a shared drive format. Until you get to the point that you sign off and say, yes, this company's met our requirements, or no, they haven't, and these are things you need to do, or else you're not doing business with the bank anymore or other business. So that's how it's been traditionally done. I did a bunch of these, and I always looked at it where this makes absolutely no sense. Like, it's great for a monetary perspective for the consulting firms, but this is horrendously manual. It's not remotely scalable. And what happens if these guys leave and their email communications are what's actually maintaining those relationships?
Yeah.
Like, how does that work? Also, who wants to answer a 500 question questionnaire? So when I was back in the US, I came into this position where I was like, I just don't understand. There's going to be a better solution. And I met Nick Sorensen, who's the then and current CEO of Whistic. And he had this concept around a profile. And a profile, the best way to think about it is like, think about your LinkedIn profile, which basically is your way, Gareth, of effectively selling yourself. You talk about your experience, your skills, your recommendations, what you do. So we thought, or they thought then, that's what we'll build for companies. They can pre-answer security questionnaires, add policies, procedures, documents. Here's our team. Here's what we've done. And then rather than saying, I'll answer your 500 question questionnaire, we'll just push this out. And they can look at that, take it all in, analyze it, ingest it, and come back with maybe 10 additional questions. True disruption. At the time, there was no one even thinking that way.
Yeah, sure.
The other side that Whistic does is they took the logical approach of saying, well, if all this like Excel stuff's happening, why don't we bring this into a platform? So we have two sides of our platform. Profile is one. That is you saying, this is my security posture. I'll share it with you. You can share it through Salesforce as well as a salesperson. The other side is we can assess our own vendors. We build a vendor repository. We send out questionnaires inside of the platform if they don't have a profile, or we invite them to build a profile in response.
Yeah.
And then we can assess them in a much faster way. So what you're getting here from this kind of way is time savings, and time savings equal money savings. Because in the end, like, I don't know if you've done research on this, but security analysts who generally answer these questionnaires are not cheap people to hire.
No,
so if I can cut down the time they spend answering a questionnaire, I'm getting money in the bank.
Yeah,
and then we bring those into what we call the trust catalog, which is where everyone who's built these profiles has these tiles. And it's kind of like a marketplace. So you can shop and say, oh, all right, there's Okta, there's Asana, there's Zoom. I can look at their trust tile catalogs and look at their security posture. That's what we do and why we do it. And the problem we solve is like reducing time in vendor assessments, reducing time in sales cycles, and enabling people to do things in a smarter way. But the way I saw value is even on top of that is once you have this marketplace, well, I can go and learn like what Zoom does for security. I can go and learn what Okta does. How do they do with pen testing? Who do they use? Like, there is inordinate amounts of information which is incredibly valuable to other security leaders. So we can build a culture where we can learn from what each other do in a really safe forum. One of the things that I hate most is you look at LinkedIn, like when the Uber breach happened, the amount of security leaders in my kind of role who were just straight on, this was the mistake they made, this is what he didn't do, this is what he should have done. That doesn't help anyone, like especially us. That puts me in more high likelihood of being in court next week. So I think if we can build these spaces where we share our security approach with transparency, that then we can learn from each other and just generally mature the industry.
Absolutely. So let's talk about cybersecurity on a more broader level then, Jake. Okay, so what are the biggest threats to organizations and governments out there that you're seeing right now?
I mean, it's a hard question because in the time I've spent in cyber, it's gone from being pen testers and auditors to being basically anything and everything. Like, we're seeing slowly the devolution of the CIO role to be absorbed into CISO roles, and I'm a classic example of that.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a lot of change and transformation in that space. We're seeing a lot of movement away from traditional infrastructure or hardware full stop. Like, if I look at our estate, we're a very typical kind of scale up where 99% of our everything is in the cloud. We literally have Wi-Fi endpoints in the office, other than that, everything's cloud. So I think that's number one for me. We still talk about cloud as if it's like happening. The reality is it's probably happened, but the truth is actually I've sat in lots of boardrooms with very, very large companies who are talking about how they're trying to move to the cloud, trying to leave mainframes. That's the reality. And so that scares the life of anyone. When you look at this hyper-connected infrastructure that we have now, AWS, GCP, Azure, maybe you're running all three, then all of your applications, whether those are HR, finance, security, recruitment, training, all the stuff that my engineering team uses, how they all connect via APIs or other means, that's a terrifying threat. API security is definitely something which we should be nervous about because we just hook these things up like we're plugging two wires together. And I don't think we really think about the exposure levels there. And that takes me on to why I ended up at Whistic is when you look at hyperconnectivity is a risk, you have to say supply chain is a massive risk. How many companies now, if you look at a supply chain, the average company says that they grow their supply chain by 30% every year. The average company used to have less than 100 vendors. We now see lots with more than 1,000 vendors. Like that's the shift of cloud and kind of consuming SaaS has really done. Most of these are software moves. Now that supply chain is unmanageable. If you're not talking to those vendors or assessing those vendors regularly, you have no idea what's going on in them. Some of these companies like pop up out of nowhere, provide a fantastic disruptive platform. We all use them, but they might never have even pen tested it. Like, what questions are we asking? So I think the rise of cloud is number one, which leads to supply chain being number two. Number three for me, like we've moved on from talking about big data. Like I think that was an old buzzword, but data full stop. Like the way we live our lives now, if you look at Google, we're massive Google Workplaces users at my company.
Yeah.
How do you look at the collaborative kind of effect later on? We've invited people into this document, externals. We've invited people into this drive. We've sent this email to that person. We've had this person on this meeting. We've had that person on that platform.
Yeah.
Like keeping track of everyone who you've interacted with and collaborated with, there is a massive tail of people who can access things that you didn't know they could access. And there's very few tools currently in that space trying to fix that problem and very few people thinking about it. And then the last one, I think those are the three that apply to everyone. The fourth, like I say, for me is always going to be about you don't know who's coming for you. Like inside of our space, I don't know if we're going to end up in some kind of war ground somewhere by accident. No one's ever going to attack Whistic. Like we're not a victim. We're not a classic company to go after. But we're ingrained in so many big companies who could be considered national infrastructure or key to national infrastructure, that if the US or parts of the Middle East go into cyber wars like we saw between the Russia and Ukraine and China and other countries in the last term, the US itself in multiple years gone by.
Yeah.
That's scary. Like you don't know how that thing's going to escalate to affect not only our company, but more importantly, like society. Like you go back several years, you look at some of the first attacks that were lodged on Ukraine, turning the power grid on and off just to check that they could. What can that affect? Like that can affect people's like hospitals. We don't know how functional the generators are. Like national infrastructure from a trains. Could that cause crashes if they're running on those trams? Like the economies. I mean, that's a terrifying thing. We're moving into a space now where wars don't mean guns, wars mean keyboards. And that scares me more than anything that could affect my work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, with this, obviously IoT is kind of coming thick and fast, isn't it? And the thing is, I mean, everything is going to become a computer. But correct me if I'm wrong, Jake. I mean, everything from your fridge to your, everything is going to be a computer. So therefore, everything is going to be able to be hacked. But if you think about the defibrillator, things like that, then obviously it becomes a huge problem, doesn't it? So yeah, that is terrifying.
I mean, if you speak to that space for a second as well, like you look at I have a big interest in this area. If you look at Bruce Schneier, like Data and the Goliath, he wrote it years ago. And that's all about this, right? The rise of Google Glass. Google Glass is a TV that's effectively always on.
Yeah.
Like that's literally watching the room all the time to learn. And if you look at how interconnected all that stuff is between Nest or Ring or smart ovens, smart fridges, smart, all of this, like we've done loads of work before in previous roles where we've hacked stuff in the house, and you can show how you can like make those blinds go up and down, or you can actually reset the address on Alexa by using the TV to send a voice message that Alexa picks up, changes the Amazon address and sends you an iPad to your house instead. It's the modern way of theft. Like there is tremendous weakness in that. And I suppose that brings on to, if you really talk about problems societally, rather than speaking about focus in industry, we're adopting and loving and enjoying technology at a tremendous rate. My mother-in-law, my own mother, my grandmothers, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they don't know what the actual risks are. We're adopting technologies and using them at such a speed without really understanding what underpins that. And often the answer is, or the question is, where's that data going? Like, it's got to be valuable to somebody. And I think that's a scary fact too.
Look, security posture I know you may not be intrinsically involved with public sector and government, but from a UK perspective, what's the security posture like of UK government and public sector organizations? I'm assuming it's probably pretty woeful. Is that fair to say?
Some of the easiest pen tests I ever did were local councils and local hospitals. Partly because their infrastructure is so old, because they're not given the budget to upgrade it and update it.
Sure, yeah.
Partly because their employees are educated, because they're more educated in the healthcare stuff, which matters to me. I'd rather they knew how to look after my children and my wife and my family than I would know how to use computers appropriately.
Yeah,
but
sure.
there's a lot of left screens, there's a lot of left devices, there's a lot of easy backdoors. So I think that's number one. Number two is the core competency and value put on people. If you look even at like GCHQ, or you look at like the military, or you look particularly in kind of the healthcare and local government sectors, you look at what they're paying for IT and cyber versus what industry will pay for the same standards. And then you have to question what quality they're going to end up with.
Yeah.
Like, you can go to the private sector and double your salary, literally double it overnight. And you can't question anyone who makes that decision. It's very few people who say, I want to stay working for the NHS in cyber because I think it's morally the right thing to do. Power to them, but there's not many of them.
No.
And so, yeah, I would say that the posture public sector is not great. And I don't think that we're seeing enough investment in it in this country. There's a lot of kind of tipping of the hat. We'll build this cyber center here. We'll spend some money educating this university. But you have to culturally change. If you don't demonstrate that you're going to put your own money behind it at a national level, you can't expect people to come along with you.
No, of course. And unfortunately, Jake, I think it's going to take a significant data breach or cybersecurity attack to change opinions on this.
And we've had them. The NHS got smashed and very little changed afterwards.
When was that?
2018, 2019? The ransomware attack.
Oh, I do vaguely remember something, yeah.
Got absolutely battered. It took several hospitals offline. Like they had to restore we're losing large data sets, but still very little actually changed.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? I think it's just a lack of sophisticated understanding at ministerial level. I think ultimately that's all you can put it down to, isn't it? Let's talk about AI. And I know you're a fan of Chat GPT. Where did you first come across this tool, Jake? And what are your thoughts on it?
So I spent a lot of time in forums, and I started to see it pop up in hacker forums, ethical hacker forums, where people would say, you can literally use this to say, I want to exploit company A, and this is the skill set I have. Give me some suggestions. The responses appeared pretty staggering. Like, I remember being back in the day at IBM when there was a lot of buzz around Watson and what Watson was capable of and could do. And that's an amazing piece of disruptive technology. IBM really paved the way for what happened in AI. I think that's an unequivocal fact. But ChatGPT is another truly disruptive technology. This has the power, in my opinion, and this video will stand the test of time, to literally replace the phrase, did you Google that? If I was Google, I'd be terrified, because Google can only return results that exist in the form they exist. ChatGPT can return results that don't exist without having to consume any actual or regurgitate any actual data. Like, that's a staggering shift. That means that education, how do you catch someone who's cheating in an essay? If the essay's been written with a coherent, logical thought path that you can't use the traditional methods of checking against databases.
Yeah, I think that there are already products popping up, though, to try and stifle this stuff from happening, isn't there? You know, to try and sniff out AI-generated content. How effective they are, though, I don't know. But it'll be like the red team, blue team penetration testing stuff that you're into, isn't it? It'll just get like that, like everything else, an arms race. But,
which is good, because it shifts it forces technological adoption and kind of improvements when there's a constant fight against each other.
Yeah.
But ChatGPT is a fascinating technology. It's made us think. Like, we sat there at the beginning of this year and went, what are our product roadmap pieces? We rose the idea of ChatGPT and went, you know what, like, we should change the way our product works. Maybe we can leverage some of those capabilities and technologies to say, rather than saying, here's my questionnaire, Gareth, can you please fill it out? Yeah. Why don't you fire it at a pre-existing profile knowledge base, have it pre-complete the answers in a new written coherent form? I mean, that's what the technology really does. And therefore do away entirely with the requirements for humans to enter kind of security questionnaire data. It could truly change everything.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to people who've looked at it and have not been that impressed. And I just think, wow, it's because they don't spend the time actually engaging with it. So, for example, if I wanted to write a blog on cybersecurity, I know people who've just done it, write the blog, read the blog, oh, that's not that great, I could do better, and just judged it. Whereas if you say, make it funnier, make it more concise, make it more sophisticated, act as though you're a cybersecurity expert, especially in ransomware, and then write it again. You know what I mean? Things like that. So if you interact with it, the outcome at the end of you being explicit is astonishingly good, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing. But the thing that really excites me, Jake, is the fact that this is ChatGPT 3.5. I think ChatGPT 4 is coming out later this year. Can you imagine how good that's going to be? Because the current version's only up until 2021, isn't it? So we'll be after all the updated stuff. But this is the first step in a journey, isn't it? Which is probably going to result in some incredible technology over the next couple of years.
Well, if you come back to my world, and you think one of the things that I used to love and one of my real passions inside of hacking is ethical hacking or social engineering. So this concept of like how you can manipulate humans into doing things for you to save you having to do traditional network attack methods. They're becoming harder and harder. Like breaching AWS is not easy, but breaching someone in a random IT technical services or HR team is a lot easier. But also traditionally trying to get those messages through. So much of your Gmail alone picks up spam attempts. It'll pick up any kind of phishing email, right? And get rid of it. The idea of like trying to pose as an African gold miner who's going to give you back $10 million for your $1 million investment doesn't exist anymore. But no. Chat GPT opens up whole new worlds. Like imagine saying act as an HR representative for Procter & Gamble and send a message to your company asking them to respond to a recent employee survey. Like the capability for it to learn, to scan the data that exists and phrase itself into a way that is truly more convincing than I can do from a mimic perspective.
Sure.
But then also do that at a scale. That could be really disruptive in the phishing world. We've seen a real decrease in phishing over time because people are getting smarter. But that could really spike it way back up again in the next year or two.
We've been talking about this for years, but it's never really played out on scale. Do you think we're going to see a lot of people losing their jobs over the next 5 years?
Yes and no. Like we've been playing the whole robot scenario out for decades, right?
Since Skynet, since Terminator.
Yeah, I mean, and before then, like 1984 and stuff, like it is really around this concept of technology evolving and controlling humans.
Sure.
There will be jobs, of course they'll go. Like Google and Amazon and others are desperately trying to claw the way out of needing lorry drivers because not only are they expensive to pay, but there's a higher risk of them crashing than a computer-controlled lorry.
Yeah.
We've already seen drone delivery bots and those little robots. You see all the drone that you've seen outside San Francisco at least anyway, delivering stuff. And we're starting to see places where you look at factory lines today versus factory lines 20 years ago. There are definitely sectors where employment is under threat and will continue to be under threat. Chat GPT has the ability to basically say no to call centers, right? Why would you need a call center?
Yeah.
It can respond audibly. It can respond to my questions better than a person can. Plus it won't get tired or annoyed at 5 p.m. So your standard customer service will always be the same. We outsource a lot of that kind of job to the Middle East and to the Far East. Maybe that goes away. But with every shift in technology, there's often other avenues that open up. So we talk about cybersecurity, right? The skills gap. Well, there's a skills gap. There's a human capital gap. So you can say, well, there's a massive issue with we're losing this industry. My industry is starving for people to go and train and become proficient in what we do. And the same will be true. Maybe ChatGPT will take away a whole section of our current economy, but it'll create a whole section too. Because you can't just leave things. There's always going to be a human subjectivity element, which is important. And there's always going to be new capabilities and competencies that are going to need to audit, manage, vet, maintain. So, yeah, I think there are jobs under threat, but I think there's also the chance for jobs to be created at the same time.
The skills gap is still very bad in the cybersecurity world then, Jake. Is it? Have you experienced that firsthand? And what are you doing to get around that as an organization?
It's not necessarily even the skills gap anymore. It's the word that's become problematic. Cyber, infosec. These words have become difficult.
Yeah.
So like our jobs change so much. So it requires people who are either specialists in certain sections or have a broad and diverse skill set to be useful across the whole piece. There is a skill shortage. It's hard and long to hire, and to get good people is expensive. The bigger problem is actually because people have seen the branding around the cyber skill shortage and seen the salary bandings and seen that, I don't know, Mr. Robot, the guy in the hoodie that looks cool, right? There's now a lot of people applying without any real experience or knowledge. So a lot of the problem in the skill shortage is actually sifting through what might be 200 resumes or CVs, of which only 50 are actually even remotely applicable. So I think we have to promote, we have to educate. I often think, like, when I hear my wife answer people, what do I do for a living? I often sound like Chandler Bing. Like, it's like, she's not really entirely sure. Yeah. So I think we need to get better at selling our own profession. And given the opportunities at a level, like you asked like a 16-year-old what they want to do, they all think they want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a professional footballer. Like they're things which we've educated society to believe these are well-paid, solid, good professions. Technologists and cyber inside of technology should be there.
Yeah.
Like, we should be able to sell out what our work-life balance is, the interest of what we do, the fact that we can disrupt and change society, the fact that we're well-paid. Like all of these things should be there to make people think at school, I'm interested. But the fundamental problem that underpins that is how many good, really experienced, knowledgeable IT teachers are there out there saying these are good, valid options. Do this. There's lots of career advisors saying, be a lawyer, you're smart, be a doctor, you've got the right grades, go and work in management, go and work in like retail, go and work in whatever it is, right? But how many people have got sitting in school saying, yeah, coding, great profession, good money, good hours, really interesting. It's just not there. We've got to change that. And we have to change it as a society, because we talk about the cyber skills gap. There's an IT skills gap. And this industry is getting bigger and the people coming into it are not. So it's a problem we have to tackle at a national level, at a policy level.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to ask you about tech innovation and what you're excited about outside of cyber.
It's a really interesting question. I suppose Chat GPT would have been number one. I think outside of that, I get excited by little things. I've spent a long time working in Silicon Valley and seeing the driverless cars go past me when I'm running and seeing the drones delivering. But it's still those kind of things that excite me. It's not the like wholesale changes. It's when someone completely rethinks how to do something. And I think we have multiple industries that are ripe for that. We look at the accounting firms. They're still auditing by putting people in front of accounts effectively. Like that could go away. We look at people who are designing buildings, architectural. Theoretically, that could go away. Like I look at like disruption and get excited. I look at anywhere where I think something can be different, and that interests me. And like I like stories. It's like if you look at like Tesla. I mean, that was a stupid idea when it first came to fruition. Like stupid idea, but it's like you can't go down a road without seeing a Tesla right now around me. Like they're everywhere. And so I think when it talks technology, I think what I get excited about is probably kind of almost gimmicky tech, I guess, because I quite like it. Yeah. And then IoT, like what is the future? I'm an advocate for privacy, so it scares me at the same time as it excites me. But you look now, we were talking the other day, my wife and I, about how it's almost impossible to commit a crime these days because it's very hard for it not to be like, there's that story, wasn't it, about the man he'd murdered his wife and he tied himself up and claimed they both had hostage. And they eventually got a conviction on him by measuring the fact that his watch, his Apple Watch, he'd walked up and down the stairs, which spiked his heart rate and showed movement during the time at which he said he was tied up. And they then forced that into a confession, right? And there's several of these kind of cases where now the way we live our lives so open and so transparent.
Sure. And
it's only getting more of that. Like, is my TV could watch me all day and it could learn from the things that I do and start selling me products based on the fact, you know what, Jake, I'm in view of my TV when I'm cooking. It took Jake too long to cook. Maybe we should offer him a better pan. It looked like he was working too hard to get the stuff off the bottom. So right now, I mean, in answer to your question, right now, I wouldn't say there's many things where I'm like, yeah, we should really get excited about that. But there's lots of areas, I think, where people are working that excites me. I've had the privilege to look at a few companies for some investors in Silicon Valley that are early day startups that work around medical implants. The idea that you can have effectively a blood monitor inside of your vein or artery, which is not just measuring pressures, but advising you to eat more sugar, less salt, less fats, change all that, predicting medical issues before they happen. That I find fascinating because we still lose too many people for stuff which we could definitely fix. We've all heard the stories about the guy that was found dead in a hotel room with a heart attack. Like, why aren't we able to find some kind of technological solution to advise and call an ambulance as soon as they notice that happening inside of his body? Yeah. So that guy has the chance to live. Like, I think that's where we should be putting a lot of our technological time and money.
I wanted to ask you about something quite specific, Jake. It's kind of more one that I sort of thought about myself around identity verification, impersonating. I mean, there's a lot, like we've had issues recently with people posing as me or one of the other directors emailing other members of staff. You must have seen this one. It's a pretty common trick, asking them for information. Mm-hmm. And when they look at the email address, it's actually a Hotmail or Gmail sort of one. So that's just on a smaller scale. But we're also seeing deep fakes, videos going up online of people like Elon Musk or Joe Biden doing horrific things and it's not even them, Look, there's a big problem with authenticity of content. Okay, have you thought about this? Are you seeing more of this, or are you seeing any innovation in this field for correcting this? I mean, it's becoming a massive problem, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a whole host of things to unpack here and talk about. I think we see a lot of it, right? I see regularly. I have a channel on Slack where our employees flag stuff, and honestly, our CEO must be asking for Google or Amazon vouchers on a daily basis. Like, we see these all the time, where he has an emergency meeting from a phone number that isn't his phone number. I think that's a big problem. Like, you look at stuff on a very simple level. Like, I remember not long ago when the passport control went on strike. My wife showed me a Daily Mail story. It was like 7:40 in the morning, and there were these massive queues. Talk about there's like 5-hour queues, and I looked at it and went, Hales, firstly, they're not striking till 9 a.m, so there shouldn't be queues already. And secondly, that's an EasyJet check-in desk from the summer that they're showing queues on. That's completely fake. But that's a major news outlet which is being consumed as fact from lots of people. And that's not a question to the people. There's two problems to solve there. I think one is, how do you verify the stuff at source? And that's really hard. Like deep fake tech. There's been loads of like BBC like dramas about the competencies of like, can you insert people and basically convict them of murders by faking evidence? If you know it's them, but you haven't got the evidence, can you create the evidence?
Right.
Which poses moral questions as well as the technological questions. How hard is it to spot? Incredibly hard. The signatures can match real video. It's immensely difficult to identify some of that stuff. And there's very few ways to intelligently and accurately identify deepfake versus a non if they've been done at high quality. The best way is education. Like whether that's tools like Know Before or Go Fish in terms of your employees, teaching them to spot stuff. Do you think that like when you get an email saying you've got a tax rebate, firstly, HMRC is never in a rush to tell you you've got a tax rebate.
No.
But if they are, they probably email from hmrc.gov. They probably don't email from like hotmail.com, for example. So spotting this stuff, or even spotting the fact this stuff's come over a third-party sender, or spotting the language, or teaching people to question it. If you get a text message from the CEO, pinging back on the number that you know for him or on Slack and say, Nick, did you just ask me for this? Go along those lines. And again, we should now be questioning the news that we look at. I left social media. Everything became very polarized.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when things are polarized, well, you have to really think about, how does Facebook make money? Facebook makes money from you being in the platform. The longer you're in there, the more they can charge marketing.
Sure.
And how do they keep you in there? If you all agree, you don't spend ages in there. You spend ages in there when you're arguing. So they will take, and I spoke to guys at Facebook. The algorithms are not a hoax. They're not like fake news. They will take you down a rabbit hole intentionally.
Yeah.
If you show a reaction to a certain thing, before you know, you've gone from slightly reactive incendiary news to completely fake non-fiction like that.
Yeah.
And
people believe it, you know.
and I think when you talk about how do you get round mimics, phishing, deepfakes, you educate people to spot issues in emails, issues in text, or even to question the news they read. Like, look at it. Does it really make sense? Look at the image that's being shown. Is there giveaways that it's not what it says it is? If it's so different from what you think the status quo is, there's a good chance it's probably not accurate. And I think that's the problem, right? When you talk about deepfake, I often go from like company and then stretch out wider. And company-wise, I can educate my workforce. My workforce is good. My employees rarely get caught by anything. They're solid because we educate them a lot.
Sure.
But society, we are literally becoming so divisive and so angry at each other about stuff which A, is probably not that relevant, and B, is not that true.
Yeah, I completely agree. This kind of ties in with some of the controversy around Cambridge Analytica, doesn't it? But,
I think also it speaks to like our relationship to data and technology. Yeah. People were shocked when Cambridge Analytica became a thing. People were like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. Like, it was a scandal. It was shocking. But you have to sit back and think, Google and Facebook and many other companies, I'm not just picking on them, many of the big tech, like Silicon Valley Leviathans, make huge amounts of money, ginormous sums of money, without charging you as a user for anything. Well, they have to make that money from somewhere. And that money comes from the value of data. And like if we talk about cyber in general, like I said, if you came back to asking me like, what is the one thing that you wish you could teach people about cyber, it's to open your eyes to the world in which you live in. You share your information transparently and proactively without knowing the inherent risks there are to sharing it. You can always have that adage that you might have nothing to hide, but that doesn't necessarily mean you want everyone to know everything at the same time.
So, look, couple of questions to wrap up then, Jake. I think we've covered some fascinating ground there, but I want to ask you a couple of quick fire questions just to wrap up. So, productivity. How do you remain productive? What's your number one piece of productivity advice, Jake?
To-do lists. I'll keep one for me, for all of my team members, and the things that I owe to people. I'm also a big advocate of exercise. I'm like a sports nut, and I think keeping fit keeps you focused. So you're being very precise and intentional with your time.
Yeah.
I think some people can manage in 4, 5, 6 hours a day, what some people manage in 8, 9, or 10, just by being more focused and more intentional about what they do.
If you could have a coffee meeting with anyone in the world, who would it be?
Alive or dead?
Dead or alive?
If we're going dead, I have a self-confessed personal love and admiration for Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
Not just because of the musical, but as an individual, probably it's worth reading his biography. One of the most fascinating people you'll ever meet. Tremendous adversity, responsible for the stock market, the modern free market, probably capitalism, let alone most of the governmental structures in place in the US and now parts of Europe. Like,
so he was one of the founding fathers of the US,
yeah,
I believe.
Yeah, one of the founding fathers, one of the original. He annoyed a lot of people and ended up dying in questionable circumstances. I don't want to ruin the ending. But it's worth following because, like I said, he literally got written out of history until people started reading up and going, oh, actually, like, this guy had a big part. And then they started down this, like, pulling a thread. They realized, actually, he's really is one of the key figures in the founding of America and the American Revolution stuff. So, alive, I think it's cliched. It is cliched. I think I'd go for Musk. I just find him such an interesting individual.
Yeah, he's a different level, isn't he? I mean, he's just.
I've heard some of those tech leaders speak publicly. Like, I've had the privilege of listening to a lot of them.
Yeah,
and they're intelligent guys. Obviously, and very successful. But Musk just thinks in a different way than most human beings do.
Yeah, absolutely. Just nothing is off the table with him, is it? I mean, I was talking to someone the other day saying who is alive now, who people will know about in 1,000 years' time. I think of 1,000 years a long time. And I wouldn't be surprised if that one person is Elon Musk, because I think what he's doing is literally changing our species, potentially.
Well, that's it, right? I said I'm an advocate and I'm a true lover of this horrible Silicon Valley term that is disruption, but it is not exemplified in any individual more than it is in Musk, who literally just goes, we're going to send people to space. And you're like, you're going to lose millions, if not billions of dollars. I'm going to do it anyway. He just wants to change things. I just love the fact that, like, Twitter didn't like the way it was run. I mean, there'll be different opinions about Twitter and Elon Musk takeover, but you can't question the true disruption of just do what he did.
So looking back in your armchair now, and I have to say, Jake, that is a very nice chair you're sitting on, by the way. What advice would you give to your 21-year-old self, looking back now?
Don't be afraid. I think we are taught inherently, again, as societally, and particularly in the UK, that there are progressive tracks, there are trajectory. You should know your place, know what you can and can't say. I say, don't be afraid to trust your gut. That's number one. And building off that, don't be afraid to take risks. People around me have questioned my decisions a lot, and I've generally ended up being right. And that's not in a kind of I'm always right way, but in a way that I think if you trust your gut and go with it, I think that's an important one. Sure. I think never forget where you came from. It's really important. And then care about people. If there's one thing, if all of those things I've already said became irrelevant, the one that matters to me is that my people that work for and with me and that I work for think I'm a good person and a good human being. They want to be with me. They want to succeed with me. They want to fail with me. They will be there when I need their back, and they will know that I will have theirs.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. The last one is, Jake, are you a reader? Do you read books very often?
I am a massive reader, yeah.
If you could pick out one, possibly two if you want, what book has really inspired you in the last couple of years?
Gosh, I would say the most inspiring book I've read is very, very off topic for this conversation, but it's a book by an Austrian psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl, called A Man's Search for Meaning.
That has been the most recommended book. I've asked that question to like 50 guests, and that is the most
actually, come on, that's interesting. Yeah. I find like that is a book, like all of my stuff I talk about people, about caring, about finding happiness and finding purpose. Like that is the book that sums it up. It's a man about finding not joy, but finding purpose even in suffering. I think that's number one. Number two, the book I'm currently reading, controversial as it will be, is Woke Inc., which is a book about how basically modern tech is manipulating changes society. And that speaks, I suppose, to my general views and opinions on how we need to be a bit more eyes open to the world that we now live in. And Alexander Hamilton's biography. Obviously, I've recommended that one already.
Right. Okay. But look, Jake, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a joy talking to you. We've covered some really fascinating territory. So, I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks for coming on the Tech Leaders Podcast.
No, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been nothing but a joy.
That was a great conversation. I was so excited to be talking to Jake, but he definitely delivered. One thing that he said, which I thought was really interesting and something that resonated with me, is about being excited about disruption. And I loved his line about Tesla being a stupid idea until it wasn't a stupid idea, and then all of a sudden they're everywhere. So I thought that was fantastic. But the two other things which caught my attention and stand out for me during that conversation, basically Jake talked about one thing that he could teach people about cyber and what it would be. And he was basically, what he chose of all the things he could have brought up, he brought up opening your eyes to the value of your data. You may have nothing to hide, but you have to realize what you're relinquishing when you give somebody else control of your data. And I just thought if everybody knew that, then it would probably be a very different environment on the internet, wouldn't it? So I thought that was a really interesting, fascinating topic. The other one that stood out for me was Chat GPT. It had to come up, but Jake made an amazing sort of observation that Google should be terrified, and I completely agree. But the one thing what actually stood out for me was, as Jake pointed out, Chat GPT can work without regurgitating data. Now I think that's an enormous game changer, because it's not plagiarizing or regurgitating or giving you anything that it's found. It's creating original content, original data, which means how are we going to catch cheaters who are cheating on exams? And the education sector's got a real issue to deal with here, and I really don't know how they're going to do it. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many other implications, I think is the right word, that come from the development of this technology. It really is a fascinating product, and the impact is going to be felt for a long time. And I think it's only going to get more and more obvious as the product develops and as people's awareness of the product develop. And there'll obviously be other things like ChatGPT that will spring up. I know Google are already working on something else quite similar. That stood out for me as well. But look, it was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for downloading.
So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for downloading this episode. We really love doing this show and are absolutely humbled by all of the incredible people who download and listen, plus the incredible guests who take the time to come on and share their secrets and experiences with our listeners. Please can I ask that you take a couple of seconds to subscribe or follow the show. This small action means a lot to us and helps us greatly. Thank you. As you quite possibly have heard me mentioning in the past, we record the mass majority of our episodes at an amazing studio facility here in Cardiff at Tramshed Tech. Tramshed Tech is a collaborative community of entrepreneurs and scaling businesses geared towards supporting growth in tech, digital and creative industries across an ever-increasing collection of locations and partner locations, UK-wide and internationally. It really is the perfect place for your business to start up, scale up, accelerate, or innovate. Head over to tramshedtech.co.uk or just search Tramshed Tech on your favorite social media platform.